Okay. How's everybody doing this morning? Okay. How's the Soylent? Okay, excellent. All right, just seeing who's awake. So I wanted to start with a quick little quiz. So I'm a professor from the University of Michigan. I also have a dual role as a chief scientist and co-founder at a company called Vertilab. So we're not as far along as Dan's company, but we did just close on our seed round on Friday, so we're finally taking off. I'll tell you a little bit about that, but it's mostly going to be about some high-level research today. It should be pretty understandable. So if you're not a security person, this is mainly for the non-security people, I'll tell you it's really hard to get security right. So I just did this exercise with my undergrads the other day. I asked them to define correctness for this keypad to go through a door. They did a relatively good job. And then I asked them to define what does it mean to be secure for this keypad. And they gave me all sorts of things like, well, if you enter the correct PIN number, the door will open. They did a few other things. An adversary shouldn't be able to do this or that without the PIN code. And what was interesting was, this is a picture I took at a hotel. The hotel decided to print the PIN code on a plastic placard. And if you can't read English, they also have the numbers in Spanish. And so the students were surprised that actually everyone who suggested a definition of security, their definition was satisfied because this placard circumvented their definition of security. So the take-home message is a lot of the problems with computer security are that not in that something is necessarily broken, but that things don't always work the way you think they should, and the model you have of security is not always how the adversary thinks. But what I'm going to talk about today is effectively sort of what can embedded systems, or what has now become more Internet of Security, Internet of Things, can learn from medical device security. And I actually brought some toys along. So this is a picture of an early defibrillator. This is a device before wireless communication was common. It's from some of my colleagues at Medtronic up in Minnesota. Can anyone guess what the little wire on the right, what its purpose is or what it does? By the way, this is while you're thinking, actually, I'm going to pass around a defibrillator. This is from a patient who no longer needed it. Here you go. That is the electrode that sends the shocks to your heart. Also senses your cardiac arrhythmias. But what do you think that little wire is for? Data, very close. So in the old days, oh yeah, you can pass that around. Just make sure it comes back. It has a street value of $40,000, so I would like it back. But in the old days, before there was wireless communication on implanted medical devices, what they would do is they'd have the patient lift up their arm, and they'd plunge a needle through their armpit and twist a potentiometer to change the heart rate. So there was very good reason to introduce wireless, but wireless can have sort of unintended consequences. So the point is, wireless addressed a specific risk, that is infection. So it was a tremendous leap in safety by introducing wireless. But wireless also has its own risks. So as Dan alluded to, I was part of a team, it was like 7 years ago now, where we reverse engineered a defibrillator. This is how defibrillators are actually implanted in practice. What you do is the surgical team first sets some initialization on it wirelessly. It gets implanted. It takes about only 90 minutes. The patient is actually awake, slightly sedated. There's a local anesthetic. After the surgical team implants the device and weaves, you'll see this little wire being passed around. After the electrode is implanted in a sacrificed blood vessel, it's sewn up, and they do some testing to make sure it works properly. And then typically the patient receives an at-home monitor. It looks sort of like a base station. It wirelessly collects telemetry from you as you're walking around. You don't even need to think about it. And then this information is forwarded up the chain through various communication pathways where the physicians and the nurses, the clinicians, can actually see the information on a website, a, quote, secure website. So when we were looking at this, we spent some time in the operating room and learning how the devices work and watching how people interact with technology. And one of the interesting things we learned was the following. I was sitting there in the room, and the lead physician said, OK, everybody stand back. We're about to induce ventricular fibrillation. And I sort of said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, in order to test if the defibrillator was implanted properly, what we need to do is induce a fatal heart rhythm and then see if the device can recognize that, that there's a fatal heart rhythm, and then shock the patient back into a normal sinus rhythm. And so I asked him, well, how is that authenticated? And the physician gave me this look. He didn't really say anything, but all I could think was something churning in his mind saying, authenta what? So that led us down this path where we discovered we could actually generate our own wireless signals that would trigger this, what is effectively a debugging command to wirelessly induce fatal heart rhythms. This has long since been fixed, fortunately, but at the time it was sort of shocking. So my view on wireless and medical devices that, so I'm from the Midwest. Oh, question.
You said this was fixed, but how do you install the update?
Oh, the question is, how do you fix this? So many of these devices have a lifetime on the order of 5 to 7 years before the battery runs out, and then it's surgically explanted and replaced. So most of these devices are off the market. There are only a few people who have defibrillators more than 10 years old. That's because there used to be some polonium-based batteries, nuclear-powered batteries, and those typically outlast the patient. But these devices don't last that long. But the interesting thing about wireless is that it was used for a specific reason, to address a clinical risk. But now I often see it used sort of willy-nilly on devices, more for the marketing side, less for actually addressing a safety risk. But my mom's from the Midwest, and she always used to put bacon on everything because she said it made everything taste better. And I think wireless is sometimes treated that way. But let me tell you a little bit. I'm going to skip through. I'm not going to be able to teach you everything about medical devices today, but let me just tell you about how malware gets into medical devices. You've probably read some things in the media, and you're probably suffering from a little bit of availability bias because the media likes to talk about what they like to talk about rather than the things that actually happen. And so one of the interesting things is hospitals often get their malware from vendors themselves. A common way is a vendor comes in with a USB stick, is doing an update of, say, the radiology software, and accidentally brings in malware. Well, guess what? No firewall is going to protect you against that. Another common mechanism is repair. I recently met an engineer from a company that had Configure get onto their pharmaceutical compounder. This is a device that makes custom liquid drugs for IV delivery. And he said, well, you know what? What's in the published media is only half the story. What actually happened when the hospital reported that their pharmaceutical device got infected with malware, what actually happened was when they brought it in for repair, the malware was accidentally spread to all the other compounders under repair. So it's really low-hanging fruit right now in terms of what's going on. I also had a very famous manufacturer who came to me saying they accidentally infected their medical devices on their product assembly line. They didn't actually have a way to detect it, but they got lucky because something just acted a little funny, and they look a little more closely, and they discovered they accidentally infected their own devices. This company was less lucky. This is a ventilator. So ventilators are fairly common in hospitals, and one day there was a recall. And to address that recall, they issued a software update. And so I went to their website. You can see down there at the bottom, it said, click here for your update for your ventilator. And I thought, wow, that's pretty progressive, pretty cool. So I clicked on the link, and this dialog box popped up. Warning, this website you're visiting appears to contain malware. Who recognizes this dialog box? OK, well, the security people. All right. So for the non-security people, this is a service from Google called the Google Safe Web Browsing Service. And what they do is they go off and spider the internet and identify what websites have been compromised and have been sort of duped into distributing malware. This medical device manufacturer was attaching this bonus piece of malware to the software update for ventilators. All I could wonder at this point was how many biomedical engineers clicked ignore. Because at the end of the day, they need to run their hospital. They need to see patients. I'm going to guess most people clicked ignore. But that's sort of the state of the art in medical device security. It's nothing too sophisticated. We're not talking about nation-state adversaries or even the kid in the basement trying to hack into things. This is garden variety malware, automated, sometimes 10 or 15 years old, getting in. I'm going to skip over a lot of history and just talk about something that happened in the last couple of months. One of my colleagues, Billy Rios, had spent over a year analyzing an infusion pump. This is the device that puts drugs into you via a little IV into one of your veins. And he discovered there were some vulnerabilities. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was killed. But here's what he discovered. This is how low-hanging the fruit is today. He discovered that there was actually, if you telnet to port 23, you get a root shell. Okay, so that is how bad it is. This is paraphrasing, but effectively the solution that was initially suggested was, well, you know, hospitals should just use a secure network. And if you're not in the security field, it's hard to appreciate the irony, but suffice to say, FDA has issued not technically a recall, but effectively a recall. They sent out a notice saying, basically, we strongly advise hospitals to discontinue use of this particular device because of the risks it presents to patients. Please use the competitor products instead, was effectively what they said. But if you take this analogy and apply it to IoT, you know, I'm sort of seeing computation added everywhere, but sometimes it's sort of willy-nilly, maybe just to make it look nice. You add bacon on everything. The question is, does it make everything better? Here's a really fun Twitter feed I encourage you to follow. I just discovered it a couple weeks ago, but you know, during the update process, you won't be allowed to drive your car, apparently, on this Tesla. But there's lots of interesting things. This is the cynical part of the talk. Let me tell you a little bit, though, about where I think some of the risks are going to be in the future, not necessarily today, but what's coming down the line. And that's my concern about devices that make automated decisions based upon what a sensor is telling you. A defibrillator is one such example. So my former postdoc, Dennis, pointed me to this news article where a gentleman's cell phone, whenever his cell phone would ring, his oven would turn on. This is called electromagnetic interference or electromagnetic compatibility. That was accidental. And so we asked the question, well, what happened if we would make our own transmitter? What kind of problems could we cause? Well, that's a lot easier to do when you're intentional. So let me just give you a couple proofs of concept. This is my laboratory. It's completely silent. All you hear is the heating and ventilation system, which is completely secure. And on the left is a webcam. We remove the housing, and you see there's a microphone. And that microphone is connected to that Macintosh on the left. On the right, you're going to see our software radio, and we've created a custom transmitter, and we're transmitting electromagnetic interference over the air, and we're trying to trick the computer into hearing things that don't exist. So in this room, this is what you could hear. Oh, sorry about that. Let me go back. A little too loud. This is what you could hear. So we modulated music over the air. So the way that actually worked is there's a hidden assumption all IoT designers make. Bits are these abstract things, but it turns out you implement them using wires. There's a tiny wire between the microphone and its amplifier. That wire has a resonant frequency. So if you transmit a carrier wave at the resonant frequency of that wire, and then you modulate some of your digital data on top of that, and then if you happen to analyze the nonlinear properties of the amplification circuitry, you can trick it into becoming an unintentional radio receiver, basically doing frequency demodulation. And I can deliver chosen digital inputs to the microprocessor through the sensor. This completely backdoors the system. It's sort of like the old day of the webs where you would just trust all user input, but that's where we are. I see him. Is that overtime or running? Oh, I'm running out of time. Suffice to say, we've done this on pacemakers too. A fun little trick you can do is if you send a particular pulse at a rate that looks like a normal cardiac rhythm, in this case 1 hertz, so 60 beats per minute, we've been able to trick pacemakers into effectively turning off. Because they say, oh, the heart is beating normally. The sensor says it's beating normally, but in fact, it's our radio frequency interference, and it just puts the device into a sort of a sleep mode. Fortunately, you don't need to worry about that particular attack in practice because the human body absorbs most of the RF, but it's more conceptual. So this didn't worry me too much until I started to see papers like the following. There was a recent paper at Usenix Security where some researchers discovered by writing to memory at particular rates, you could cause the memory bus to act as a transmitter. And you can transmit arbitrary waveforms to nearby devices. So if you were thinking, well, nobody would put a transmitter near me, well, guess what? If you have a computer, you've got transmitters that are completely programmable. Another colleague had worked on influencing sensors in the analog realm. He discovered if you send acoustic tones to a particular drone, you can cause the drone to fall out of the sky because the MEMS accelerometer on the inside of the chip has a resonant frequency. And if you hit it at 8 kilohertz, it just tricks that little mass just perfectly to confuse the software on the inside, and it loses complete control. There was another fun paper recently called Rowhammer. Rowhammer, this is all the code you need to write to cause this particular flaw. If you read from memory at a particular rate while flushing the cache, you can cause these transient failures where your memory loses charge, and you can actually cause chosen corrupted bits in memory. This was originally a reliability problem, but then some Google researchers discovered how to turn this into a security problem. For instance, you could, in theory, use this to get supervisor privileges by changing arbitrary values in memory. So the lesson on sensors is basically trust but verify. A lot of IoT devices are taking in sensor data, and they're just acting on it blindly. But you need a way to verify that what you're sensing is actually a real physical phenomena. So I'm completely out of time, but I'm just briefly say, on the company side, one of my students discovered that he could actually tell what website I'm browsing by looking at my power consumption from the power outlet. He had a hard time publishing that, so I told him, why don't you figure out how to detect malware instead? Long story short, 3 years later, it's now a product. So this particular product is designed for ruggedized environments like hospitals. So you can bleed on this, designed to be bled on actually, and so the biomeds can clean off the blood. Whatever you want to protect, you just plug it in, and it uses machine learning in order to look for anomalous activity, for instance, parts wearing out too early, as well as malware. All I wanted to say, I'm not going to talk too much about the product or how it works on the inside, but I wanted to just quickly talk about the team, because I think we have a sort of unique story. Our team was built sort of from this IoT house of cards. My house collapsed about 2 or 3 years ago, and so what I discovered was the best way to find a team for a startup is you get a bunch of people to help you out in crisis, and the people who work well together, they're going to stick around. So what we actually did was completely rebuilt the house. So you can see our first office was a garage with outdoor plumbing as we were rebuilding the house. Our CEO was actually, his job at the time was implanting self-powered computers in all my concrete walls. And so they were having a lot of fun in this un-air-conditioned space. And they worked so well together. They hadn't really thought about doing a startup, but they discovered that they worked so well together at dealing with these problems and getting people, contractors, to do things that they started a company. And we've recently started expanding and hiring. So here we have our operations manager, Anne, and she's doing log analysis at the moment in my backyard. Actually, how I first met Dennis was after that, I said I needed to put manure all over my yard, and I convinced him to shovel all that. So here we are getting stuff done in my yard. But we work well together, and we're having a lot of fun building products and protecting systems that are very difficult to protect, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in hospitals and high consequence devices. But I see I'm over time. I'll end there, and we'll take questions at the panel. Okay, thanks. Oh, I would like my defibrillator back, though. Oh, yeah. Let's see.